Islamic personalities from a historical perspective. We explore politicians, mujaddideen, resistance leaders, famous thinkers, poets. Inshallah, we'll be introducing a lot more over the next few months, inshallah. And welcome to the children that are upstairs. Thank you for being here, mashallah. If you are a part of MYG, it'll be happening upstairs with Sheikh Misra and Sheikh Shah, inshallah. Dr. Sohaib does not need an introduction. He's a child of our community, mashallah. Has been here and grown up with us forever. Dr. Sohaib is the current librarian of the Middle Eastern Islamic Studies at UCLA. He's a very prominent in our community, mashallah. We go to him for a lot of our history and a lot of... also, I wanted to mention Dr. Sohaib is also on the Board of Education for OCS, and mashallah comes from a dear family of ours at the masjid. I won't delay too much. Dr. Sohaib, take it and run.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, it's great to be here. I'm very excited to be launching this series with ISOC, where we'll be covering, as Brother Amir mentioned, influential personalities from the Muslim world, statesmen, leaders, poets, scholars, men and women both, that we ought to know more about as Muslims, to become more familiar with our own history as well. And the goal will not simply be to share some interesting anecdotes, some interesting stories, but to do a deep dive as much as we can, as much as time permits and as much as our sources permit, to understand these personalities closely and to understand the impact and the role that they had in their respective societies. So today, we will be speaking on Imam Shamil of Dagestan. And before I get into him, I'm just curious, has anyone ever looked into the life of Imam Shamil from Dagestan before? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, that's a good number, mashallah. Imam Shamil was one of the most influential, legendary leaders, warriors, scholars in the history of all of Dagestan. And he's only from the 19th century, so very, very recent. It's only about 200 years ago. And so today our discussion will be framed by 4 questions that I'll be exploring. The first is his context. What were the ideas, the institutions, the individuals that shaped his upbringing and growth? And we'll be talking about some of his teachers and some of the main influential ideas circulating in his time. The second are the challenges. What were the challenges that he faced in his society in 19th century Dagestan? The political, moral, economic challenges that he faced in his day. And the third, what were his solutions? How did he address those challenges? What was their impact? And finally, how may we interpret his legacy? What are some lessons we can draw upon about his life? So these are the 4 main questions that will be guiding our discussion today, inshallah. So to begin with the very beginning, the context, we have to go back to geography. And the map here isn't very clear for you. So let me try zooming in. So where is Imam Shamil located? He's located in Dagestan. Where is Dagestan located? In the Caucasus region. Where is the Caucasus region? That is a border region between Eastern Europe and Asia and Anatolia. And as the name Dagestan is a Turkish-Persian compound. So Da means mountain in Turkish, and Istan means, can anyone tell me what Istan means? The land. So it's the land of mountains, literally. That's what Dagestan means. Because there's a huge mountain range, the Greater Caucasus Mountains, that span this region from the Black Sea all the way to the Caspian Sea, as well as another lesser Caucasus mountains that run this geography as well. And so because of this unique position, the whole Caucasus region has very unique personalities. One of them is that it's a crossroads for a lot of people moving in and out uh, through Europe and Asia. So there's huge intermingling between different societies and people. And the other is that because of its mountainous region, it is really hard for anyone to control. And for that reason, there's a lot of independent people living around over there who develop their own cultural, linguistic traditions. So huge diversity of languages. When the Romans tried to conquer the Caucasus region, they are said to have required about 100 language interpreters. When the Muslim geographers speak about this region in the medieval period, they talk about 70 languages from this region. So you have the Caucasian peoples, the Abkhaz, who have several categories are listed over here. There's the Circassians, the Cherkess people who are Muslims, the Georgians who are Christians, the Dagestanis who become largely Muslim, and within them you also have the Avar people, which is a group of people that Imam Shamil comes from. And then you have the Chechens, then you have Armenians, you have Iranians, you have other Turkic groups, the Mongols come as well. So it's a huge diversity over here, and that will be one of the challenges that Imam Shamil also faces in his time. And this here is a rendering of the contemporary breakdown in terms of nation states. So you have Dagestan, which is now a republic of the Russian Federation, and next to it is Chechnya, right over here. Below it is Azerbaijan. Then you have Georgia as well, and then Turkey over here. Just to give you a sense of what we're dealing about in terms of today's boundaries. So how does Islam get to Dagestan? How does Imam Shamil and his community become Muslim? And this has a long and very early history, actually. It goes back to the time of the Sahaba, radiallahu anhum, the time of the Khalifa Umar, radiallahu anhu. During his time, an expedition of Sahaba come all the way to the city of Derbent, which I will just zoom in here. You can see in the circle. Now, this city, as you can see, is right on the is one of the main routes across the mountains. So it's a very pivotal city in terms of trade and traffic. On the one hand, you have the Caspian Sea, and the other hand, you have the mountains. And this is a contemporary skyline of Derbent today. It's a very beautiful place to visit. So the Sahaba come here to Derbent, and they're actually even buried here today. So there's about a group of 40 Sahaba who are buried in a cemetery today, and the cemetery is called Kirklar, coming from the Turkish Azeri word 40, Kirk. So 40 Sahaba are buried here today. And I want to just stop and pause, reflect on that, because for centuries afterwards, the Muslims won't actually advance beyond this. The mountains, the people in the mountains will actually fiercely resist the Muslims for a long time. And Derbent, this city over here, will be their main stronghold that Muslims are coming in and out of. And you can speculate that one of the main reasons for this is that the Sahaba radiallahu anhum actually traveled to this place, conquered it, and then were buried here. And the fact of them being buried here served as that anchor for Islam in this region. When I came across this cemetery, it reminded me of a quote I had read back in graduate school from a book by Eng Seng Ho called The Graves of Tarim, where he covers the spread of the Hadrami diaspora, a group of Yemeni ulama and Sufi, so forth, who traveled throughout the Indian Ocean. And he writes about them, in a society of migrants, what is important is not where you are born, but where you die. Graves, while they are the endpoints for migrants, are beginnings for their descendants, marking the truth of their presence in the land. And this is something that you could see reflected here, that just by, they didn't just come there, conquer it, and leave it, but they were buried here, and that became a landmark for the city, bringing the people in becoming the connection to Islam. And this is something you see throughout the Muslim world. When you think of the historic Muslim world, it's not just filled with, beautiful masjids, beautiful madrasas, other places, but there are also tombs of pious people. And that, in many ways, becomes the living connection of the people to Islam and to the religion for the next centuries. And that's something to think about as well when we consider living and bringing our roots here in this country as well. The role of cemeteries is also extremely important in setting down our roots in this place. So over the next few centuries, the Muslims continue to expand in Dagestan, in the Caucasus region. There's different ideas that come about. There's this idea of Kuhe Qaf, this mythical mountain of Qaf, which is supposed to be like the highest peak of this mountain range. And over there, some geographers talk about that this is the homeland of the jinn, and this is where they actually belong. And there's like emeralds there over there, and they can ascend all the way to the heavens. So a lot of different ideas float about because of the immense, unique nature of this mountain range. And it's not, and the Muslims aren't the only ones to come about with these ideas about the Caucasus Mountains. In the 19th century, the Europeans also come up with this racial theory that white people, that Europeans come from the Caucasus region, that they all descended from the Caucasus region, which has no basis in science or in history. It's just something that was concocted by a few German scientists, historians, scholars, and now it's stuck around in popular American discourse. Just a digression, I was summoned to jury duty a few weeks ago, and the judge there was asking everyone, their ethnicity. So all the white people in the room were just saying Caucasian, Caucasian, we're Caucasian. And then there was this Middle Eastern looking person who also raised up and said, I'm Caucasian too. And so when we later found out that he was actually Armenian, Lebanese Armenian, but he may have been technically more correct to have that right upon the Caucasus than all these white people who are saying they're Caucasians. So to move on, Islamization in this region happens very gradually over centuries. So you have, the Mongols come and invade this region. Timur comes in the 14th century. The Ottomans and Safavids fight over this entire region. And it's only really in the 17th and 18th centuries that Islam begins to expand and become entrenched in the mountain regions of Dagestan and Chechnya as well. And there are a few notable highlights from this period. One is that Arabic becomes the lingua franca. So even though there's a huge diversity of languages and cultures in that time, the educated elite, all speak and write in Arabic. And pictured here is a manuscript from UCLA Library Special Collections. This is a text written in 1754 in Dagestan by a local scholar, and it is in praise of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. An entire text that he composed over here in Arabic as well. And then you also have Arabic being used as the script for the local languages. So the Avaric language is one of the main languages of the region. And you have that. This is another manuscript as well from UCLA Special Collections. And you can see over here, I'm just zooming in as much as I can, the overlined parts are in Arabic. So it's a text on Aqidah. It's talking about wujud, existence, and the attributes of God. And then the text that is not overlined, that is in the local language, the translation and the commentary. Again, from the 18th century. So you can see here that ulama are focusing on issues of aqidah, theology, as well as seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, teaching Islam to the local people. So the 18th century then is that region where you have this growth in Islam and growth in scholarship, but it's also a time when people are still holding on to many of their older customs that they have. So there's something called ada or adat, which is a local custom, the local way of doing things. So this is legal, ethical, moral, so forth. And we'll get into this, but this is one of the key battlegrounds that Imam Shamil actually faces in his lifetime. Doing things based off Sharia versus local custom. One of the interesting parts of this is that beer drinking and alcohol was pretty common and prevalent from what we can see in this time period, even among scholars. So there's one particular scholar, Abu Bakr bin Muawiyah. He writes an entire risala, an entire treatise, arguing for the prohibition of alcohol and intoxicating drinks. But this is a manuscript from UCLA as well. And in this manuscript, he has a very interesting line where he says, at the very beginning, so after the hamd and the salawat, he says, وَبَعْدْ فَيَقُولُ الْفَقِيرُ إِلَى رَحْمَةِ رَبِّهِ الْقَدِيرُ أبو بكر بن معاوية العيمكي So the destitute for the mercy of his Lord, Abu Bakr bin Muawiyah says, لما رأيت علماء داغستان ومتعلميهم فضلا عن عوامهم غافلين عن أمر الشارع في هذا النبيذ المسكر الشنيع. When I saw that the ulama of Dagestan and their teachers, not to mention the common people, are ignorant of the command of the lawgiver of Allah regarding this intoxicating, he calls it nabith, it's also called buza in the local language. مكبين على شربه ولو في المساجد والمدارس متلذذين به كأنه قربة إلى المبدئ البديع. That they are insisting on drinking it, even in the masajid and in the madrasas, deriving pleasure from it as if it is bringing them closer to Allah. So he's writing this in the 1750s about the people of Dagestan. So even though you can see that Islamization has a long process, it doesn't happen overnight. And so the ulama at this time are trying their best to overcome local culture regarding wine and alcohol and so forth. And so this brings up then to the time of Imam Shamil. He's born at the very end of the 18th century, 1797, and we'll get into a bit of his early life. There isn't that much detail that we know about his childhood. So we know, for instance, that he was best friends with this person, Ghazi Muhammad, who was really, really influential in his life. Ghazi Muhammad was just a few years older than him, and together they would go and study. So they learned Arabic. They could speak and write fluent Arabic. They could write Turkish. They could write Russian. They could speak as well as their local languages. And that forms like the enduring quality of his personality. So even later in life, during his campaigns, he will always be still attached to his books, his manuscripts as well. And he actually accumulates a library. And spoiler alert, but once he's eventually exiled to the Russian Empire, he'll ask to bring 50 of his manuscripts with him to the library, with him to Russia. And then eventually some of these will make their way to Princeton University Library, where they're actually digitized and you can find many of them today. And what he'll do is he'll write out entire books by hand, because at that time they weren't using the printing press. So to get that copy of a manuscript, you would have to write it out by hand. So he copied out books of fiqh, of aqidah, and so forth during this time period. And these are some articles you can read. So some of their teachers, Ghazi Muhammad and Imam Shamil, were Sayyid Jamaluddin and Muhammad al-Yaraghi. Now, what is distinctive about these two teachers is that they belong to the Naqshbandi Khalidi tariqa, which is a major Sufi tariqa of the time of the Muslim world. So Muhammad al-Yaraghi was a student of someone who was a student of Khalid al-Baghdadi, who was the tariqa, the sub-branch of the tariqa is named after the Naqshbandi Khalidi tariqa. Imam Khalid actually traveled to India in the 1810s. So right around that time, 1810s, and he studied with a scholar there, Shah Ghulam Ali, who himself was a student many generations of Ahmad Sirhindi, of Imam Rabbani, who was a major figure in South Asian Mughal history. And Ahmad Sirhindi himself took the tariqa all the way back to Bahauddin Naqshband, who is now buried in Bukhara in Uzbekistan, and that is a picture of his tombstone over there. So you can see also that Dagestan is connected to the circuits of ulama and Sufis coming from India, from the Ottoman Empire. And there is this trope that you might see that Dagestan is this remote region cut off from the Muslim world that some people like to write about, but actually it's connected to these developments, very new developments. 1810s he went to India, and already these ideas that he is preaching will spread in Dagestan. So what were these ideas that the Naqshbandi Khalidi tariqa advanced? And it's a really big tariqa. There's a lot you could write about it. The main elements that I have seen that the Dagestani scholars themselves emphasized is these three things. One is this adherence to Sharia, to the Quran and Sunnah, holding firm to it, as opposed to Ada, or the local custom that was there. The second is Khalwa, so going in seclusion, spending time away from people, meditating, spending time in worship of Allah, away from people. And the third is silent dhikr. So doing dhikr in a more silent way as opposed to a more loud way, which would be the way of the Qadiri tariqah. So these are the three elements of the Naqshbandi Khalidi tariqah, and the most important of them in this context being Sharia, being this emphasis on following the law of Allah as opposed to local customs that were there prevalent at the time. And the other thing I will emphasize here, as part of Imam Shamil's upbringing, is physical exercise. There are lots of stories about his exercise, the way in which he trained himself as a young boy. There are stories that he would be training himself so intensely, so strenuously, that his mother would tell him to stop. Like, why are you training yourself? And he would respond, and this is a quote, "If you allow your body to get out of hand, it will be impossible to get it back into shape when the day of trial comes." So even as a young boy, he was training himself for a day of trial, for having to use and to exert his body for a larger mission. And there are other stories where, for instance, he was out with a caravan to a neighboring city, and a group of young, older boys decided to attack him and to steal the wealth in that caravan. And then he challenged them each to a wrestling match. And he took them down. They thought he was like a skinny, frail young boy, but he wrestled them down to the ground one by one and eventually caught up to his caravan. There's another story as well where a group of boys were so jealous of him that they ganged up on him and actually stabbed him and hurt him. So instead of going back to his village, he just stayed in the woods, nourished himself off of the land, recovered by himself, and then came back to his place. So, alongside academic, work, learning Arabic in religion and so forth, getting this Sufi, this spiritual training, he also had this physical training as well that he underwent. So now going to the challenges of his day, the part two of this presentation. What were the challenges that he faced at his time? So internally, there is immense local disunity. Part of this is due to the fact that it's a mountain region, everyone is independent, no one wants to submit to the authority of another person. And then compounded by that, you have clans and tribes. The local Ada held communal responsibility as opposed to individual responsibility. So if someone stole something from another clan, the entire clan would be responsible. And this would cause blood feuds to go on for hundreds of years, literally in that time. The other threat that he faced is the tendency of some people to just be bought off by the Russians. People would make concessions, elites would have their interest in making their own treaties with the Russians, and they would go behind the back and stab Imam Shamil and his movement in the back. So that's internally, there's challenges. And then you have externally, they have overwhelming Russian military strength. So why are the Russians so strong? Well, they've been accumulating their power over the centuries. It's a huge empire. And they've been beating the Ottomans for a long time now. In the 1760s, they have several wars with the Ottomans in which the Ottomans have to give up and give some concessions, which actually frees up the Russians to have an open hand in the Caucasus regions. So they continue to advance there. And during this time, their very, very initial advance is extremely ruthless and very, very harsh and very overtly Christian. They're bringing Christianity to this region. And that really upsets the people of Chechnya in particular. And there's a particular person, Sheikh Mansour, who comes about. Sheikh Mansour is a very interesting personality. We don't know much about him. He's just maybe an illiterate, poor farmer or so. And he gets sick and tired of the Russian oppression. He's 25 years old. He divorces his wife. He retreats into a cave. He does his own khalwa, his own reclusion, and then he starts a resistance movement against the Russians. So he has some initial victories, surprise victories, and then he's eventually captured and killed by the Russians. So that's one of the first resistance movements in the region against the Russians. And then you have the Russians annex Georgia. Georgia is a Christian area, Christian kingdom, so the Russians take over Georgia. And then in the 1820s, they have several wars with the Qajars, with the Iranian Empire, and they beat them. So the Iranians secede Azerbaijan, as well as officially Dagestan and Chechnya to them. So the Russians have now, by the time of the 1828, they have surrounded Chechnya and Dagestan by all sides. Azerbaijan, Georgia, this entire place is surrounded by them. And Dagestan and Chechnya are left isolated and alone from the rest of the Muslim world. And this is the time that the people of Dagestan now begin to take matters into their own hands. In 1829, that is a moment when the people of Dagestan come together and proclaim Imam Ghazi Muhammad, the friend of Imam Shamil, as the first Imam of Dagestan. Now, how did Imam Ghazi get selected? How did people actually know about him? Well, it's because he had already been preaching to the people for many, many years, calling to Islam amongst the locals. And initially, the Naqshbandi Khalidi tariqa that he was part of, it only focused on personal reform. So, improving your worship, not doing sins, giving up alcohol, things like that. It would just focus on personal worship, purification of the soul, very spiritual thing. It is only at this moment when matters escalated so bad that the people requested Imam Ghazi to lead them and to resist the Russians, that it begins to take a more military character. And so Imam Ghazi is the one who sets the foundation for military strategy in this time period. What he'll do is he'll spread false rumors, mislead the Russians, he'll exploit weak points in their army, and he'll also take the initiative to surprise them in many ways. And this becomes like the main way in which they begin to execute the military campaigns. So a few years later, there's a famous battle, the Battle of Gimri, and this is a portrait of that place, where the Russians will come and basically surround Imam Shamil and Imam Ghazi Muhammad, who are there with about 300 of their followers, and they will besiege them, cut them off, use their artillery against them, and eventually they will come and kill every single person except for 2 people. So Imam Ghazi is actually made shaheed or martyred in this battle, and of the people who survive, Imam Shamil is one of them. And there's a famous account of how Imam Shamil escapes capture. I'm just going to read it aloud. It's an account by a Russian officer who was a witness of the scene. And he says, "It was dark. By the light of the burning thatch, we saw a man standing in the doorway of the building, which stood on raised ground rather above us. This man, who was very tall and powerfully built, stood quite still, as if giving us time to take aim. Then, suddenly, with the spring of a wild beast, he leapt clean over the heads of the very line of soldiers about to fire on him. And landing behind them, whirling his sword in his left hand, he cut down 3 of them, but was bayoneted by the 4th, the steel plunging deep into his chest. His face, still extraordinary in its immobility, he seized the bayonet, pulled it out of his own flesh, cut down the man, and with another superhuman leap, cleared the wall and vanished into the darkness. We were left absolutely dumbfounded. The whole business had taken perhaps a minute and a half." So this is a famous account which establishes Imam Shamil's legend. It sounds like it's out of a movie where someone jumps out of a cliff and still survives to fight another day. And it's also a very interesting moment, because 300 people are killed and only 2 survive. And this only marks the beginning of Imam Shamil's career. The rest of his resistance comes to him. So after this time period, he recovers with his wife, Fatima, who's actually the daughter of one of his teachers. And today you can actually see the building where he made his escape. They've reconstructed a tower, and you can actually visit and go over there as well. So Imam Shamil is now appointed after. So yeah, before that, there's another Imam who comes, Hamza Baig, after the death of Imam Ghazi Muhammad. He's killed a few years later by someone locally from the Avar tribe who was doing a revenge killing. And then Imam Shamil is appointed as Imam. And there's like accounts of how he resisted being the Imam. He didn't want to do it. There was this like dramatic ceremony where people are crying and he's saying, "I don't want to do it." And eventually he agrees to become the Imam in 1834. And so during this time period, there are other claimants who want to become the Imam, and he doesn't fight them. He doesn't try to do anything with them. He actually just worships Allah. He spends a lot of time in the masjid praying, reading Quran, doing dhikr, and eventually people come around to support him entirely. And one of the first things he does is to actually have a peace treaty with the Russians, where he gets time to rebuild his forces, regenerate his time, his strength over here. And eventually there's a battle of Akhulgo, 1839, where the Russians, similar to the Battle of Ghimri, they come and they surround him and they're besieging him and they're basically winning. And so during the negotiations, they ask for his son as a hostage, to keep the peace between them. And Imam Shamil is refusing, he doesn't want to give up his son, who was about 8 or 9 years old at the time, to the Russians. But eventually, seeing the condition of his men and so forth, he agrees to that. So he gives away his son, but the Russians break the word and continue to fight them and attack them. So this is one of the lessons he learns about the treachery of the Russians and how they don't keep their words when they pretend to argue for peace treaties, which is something we also see today. So I just want you to imagine, though, what would be your feeling when you're about to give up your 8 or 9-year-old son to this Russian army who immediately exile him away to the capital of the Russian Empire? What kind of dua would you read? You'd say, may Allah bring my son back, keep him safe, something along those lines. I would probably say something like that. But look at the poetic dua that is recorded by a scribe of his who was an eyewitness of the account. He said, Lord, you raised up your prophet Musa alayhi salam when he was in the hounds of Fir'aun. This is my son. If I formally hand him over to the kuffar, then he is under your care and protection. You are the best of guardians. So this is a beautiful dua, a beautiful way to place this, this moment. And it tells you how connected he was to prophetic history and prophetic tradition as well. Being able to bring about this feeling in that moment in dua over here. So after 1839, Imam Shamil actually has another dramatic escape because they come and destroy everyone over there, and the only way he escapes is that he has a dummy raft. So there's a river over there, and he sets up a raft with some dummies over there to mislead the Russians. So the Russians go firing after that raft, whereas then Imam Shamil leaves with some of his family in a different direction. Now, 1839, Imam Shamil has basically lost all of his territory. So he goes to Chechnya, and over there he begins to rebuild his power. The Chechens actually ask him to become the imam of the region over there. And he uses a different set of tactics. So this is a description from a historian, a military historian. I'm just going to read it out. A master of deception, in full control of his forces through the most complicated maneuvers, realistically appreciating the balance of power and the advantages and disadvantages of both his and his army's forces, and able to utilize them fully. Determined and confident in his moves, yet flexible in both preparing and carrying out his plans, and quick to take advantage of his enemy's mistakes. So again, one of the main things he would use is surprise, to mislead the Russians, think that he was going to attack in one place, but actually ending up attacking in a different place. He also would be commanding several forces in separate locations, having them move apparently out of order, but they would land up at the last moment at the same city, surprising the Russians. And this required immense discipline of his forces that he had built up over these years. This requires a professional army. It also requires swiftness, being able to move really, really fast in this very, very difficult mountain terrain. And then he began to use artillery captured from the Russians. So the Russians had this monopoly on artillery, and he began to use that against them. So 1843, he had this major victory against the Russians, and news began to spread about his exploits. So this is the Times of London, March 1844. Wellington and Napoleon were the heroes of the first 15 years of the 19th century. Their successors in glory, for their names will never perish, are Abdul Qadir and Shamil. Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi from Algeria, and then Shamil from Dagestan. So there's international media also following this conflict and actually cheering on Imam Shamil, especially the Russians' enemies. So besides having this military strategy, this guerrilla warfare that he's doing, he's also creating a state apparatus, an Islam. So he has an entire bureaucracy. He has naibs, who are his lieutenants, his deputies under him. He has qadis, he has muftis, and he has a diwan, provincial council. He has a lot of people working in a very systematic way under him, uniting the people of Chechnya and Dagestan. So he also has a department that's collecting zakat for the first time in many of these regions. There's departments for social welfare of widows and orphans. There's land taxes. There's commerce and so forth being managed. So it's not just military warfare that he's doing, but he's actually a statesman at this point, managing the entire region for the first time that had never united under one single ruler. And that is another reason for his success, but also tension. So many of the times, the Chechens who are not used to paying taxes like zakat and so forth, they would become extremely upset and fight against some of his moves that he had ordered. Now, one of the episodes that happens in the 1850s is really, really famous, is that, recall that Imam Shamil's son was captured by the Russians. He's still there in the Russian capital during this time period. So a group of his followers, Imam Shamil's followers, in 1854, go to Georgia and capture some princesses over there. They do a raid and they capture them, and they're all adorned with their jewelry and their staff and so forth. And it becomes a huge affair that blows up in international media and so forth. So after the princesses are returned in 1855 in exchange for Ghazi Muhammad, there's books written about them. There's a French tutor with them who writes an entire book on them. Then there's Russian journalists who come and interview the princesses and write books that just sell out immediately. So they have to multiple printing editions of these books. Then that book is translated into English as well. And one of the main themes of these books is that they actually praise Imam Shamil. They don't actually, they can't actually critique him. So none of their jewelry is stolen. None of them are harmed. None of them. There's actually praise that such a multitude of strong, handsome mountain men and horses all assembled in one place. The women come out of Imam Shamil wearing niqab in front of him, and they're living in his residence. So they actually observe his wives. He has 4 wives working in the residence together, and none of them are being compelled, according to their own observations, to stay there. They actually meet one of his wives who's Armenian, a convert to Islam, and they're confused and baffled as to why an Armenian is converted to Islam, and she assures them that her love for Imam Shamil and for the religion is true. They also notice that Imam Shamil is extremely warm towards children. So there's this idea of this savage mountain man, and he's being really playful and warm with his children. So it's very contradictory for these Russians that here's this our enemy, our savage mountain beast enemy, and he is exhibiting such nobility in his character. And the point towards children, when they actually return the princesses in exchange for Ghazi Muhammad, they have a very dramatic reunion with Ghazi Muhammad, with Imam Shamil and his son, and in which Imam Shamil just breaks down weeping. And that also really surprises them, that they didn't expect to see such emotion from him. And there's an account from one of his scribes of that reunion of when Imam Shamil was united with his son again. So it says, as for the Imam, he sat under a tree, crying, humbling himself before God, thanking him and saying, praise God and exalt him. He asked me, did you not see what your Lord did with what was given by you to him as a trust and charge, i.e. his son, Jamaluddin? Now, the Imam Shamil will continue his campaigns, but there's a limit to his clock. The Russians have unlimited, immense firepower, and Imam Shamil slowly has these defeats. And the Russians have to change commanders. They change commanders many times, have to fire and reappoint new people to take upon him. And they change their strategy where they begin to burn down the countryside, the trees where the Mujahideen would take refuge and so forth. So by 1859, they eventually come to this place called Ghunib, and this is a contemporary picture of the place. To come here, they besiege Imam Shamil, and they force him to surrender. And there's lots of dramatic accounts of his surrender where he was not wanting to surrender, and his family and his sons and other people were compelling him to surrender. And then looking eventually after, at the state of difficulty of his people and so forth, he finally surrenders. And from here, he's actually taken back to the Russian capital. He's not killed, he's not executed, but in 1859, he goes back to the Russian capital as under arrest, but treated as a celebrity. So the Tsar at the time, he treats him as a guest. He frequents their dinners and parties that they're invited to, and he becomes a curiosity for the locals as well. And the news of his exile also spreads. So here is the New York Times in 1859, the fall of Shamil, saying that the fall of Shamil will no doubt evoke a good deal of sentimental sorrow from hundreds of tender-hearted people who think savages and hill robbers the most interesting of mankind, and delight to take sides with raw flesh in Rousseau against toothbrushes and civilization. And it goes on and on. So there's this, again, this trope of like the noble savage. Here's this savage person, but we have this sorrow and the sympathy for him. So from Russia, he eventually, he's treated with this fanfare. He gets his library over there. He asks for permission to move to another place in Ukraine, and he moves over there in the 1860s. And eventually, he asks for permission to perform the Hajj as his last and final desire in life. And the Tsar grants him this permission, but keeps two more of his sons as hostage while he goes and completes his Hajj. So he gets to go and complete his Hajj. He actually goes and meets the Ottoman emperor in Istanbul, the Ottoman Sultan, as well as some of the Egyptian elite over there. Eventually, he completes his Hajj, and then he goes from there to Medina. And during this time, he has this dua. Oh Allah, if my intentions, my endeavors, my exertions, my battles for the true faith are pure before you and have found the approval of your messenger, then do not remove me from the closeness to your prophet. Let me die in the sanctuary of your beloved one. And that is what happens, and this is the account of his death by one of his biographers on February 4, 1871, 25 Dhul Qa'dah. So just a few weeks after Hajj, just before Maghrib or evening prayer, Shamil roused himself. At last, all his old force sounded once more. Allah, Allah, he cried exultantly, and then the strange half-shut eyes closed forever. And he was buried there in Jannatul Baqir, and that is a picture of how it used to be at the time. So this is the dramatic end of Imam Shamil in 1871 here in Medina, one of his few countrymen who actually fought 25 years of resistance against the Russians and then lived to die in Medina over here. So to wrap up some conclusions that we may share, some thoughts. One may say, like, why did he fight? The Russians were just so strong and so militarily advanced. What was the point of mounting this resistance? But you have to take into account that he, at the height of his power, he only commanded maybe like 40,000 troops or 50,000 troops, fighting against hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. And this was due, and this is something that built his legacy. So one of the few things that we find inspiring is the persistence in face of his upsets. Coming from the Battle of Ghimri in 1829, when he's one of two survivors of an entire battle, and goes on then to fight for 25 years against the Russians, and then having another major defeat, and then rebuilding again and being able to fight the Russians again in the face of incredible upsets. This incredible willpower and determination was something that is definitely very, very inspirational. And then there's the fact that this required a lot of hard work. This was not easy work. There's this anecdote of when he was in the Tsar in his palace. The Tsar was asking him, like, how did you fight me for 25 years? And he told him, well, for 25 years, I had, whenever I ate food, it was the best of food with honey and butter and bread. And whenever I slept on a mattress of feathers. And the Tsar was confused, like, how did he live in such luxury in the mountains? And he explained to him that, we would be so hungry that whenever we would eat something, it would feel like the best of food that we ever tasted. And we would be so tired that whenever we slept, even on a rock, on a stone, on the mountains, it would feel like we're just sleeping the deepest of sleeps. and so forth. So this was like hard work of 25, 30 years. And building a legacy of such a nature isn't something that comes through softness and luxury and comfort and so forth. And then there's the fact that even Russian literature has acknowledged his own nobility and his legacy. The famous novelist Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace, he was a soldier in the army against the Caucasus. And he wrote most of his experiences in this novel, War and Peace. Has anyone here read War and Peace? Curious. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so most of his experiences came from this war. And he also wrote another book called Haji Murad, and one of the lieutenants of Imam Shamil who fought with him as well. But the most important part of his life and his career was this call to Islam. Now, how did this call to Islam work? In the face of disunity, it created this common identity. So the Dagestanis and Chechens were divided into so many different clans and tribes and so forth. It created this common sense of brotherhood and this common front against the Russians. But it wasn't just simply an identity. It wasn't simply identity politics and we're Muslims and so forth. But he created an entire bureaucratic state with norms and legal concepts and rules and Islam that came with that to eliminate the blood feuds and other tribal wars that were happening in that region. So it wasn't just empty slogans, but it was entire state apparatus. And then there was also Imam Shamil's connection to Islamic legacy in this region. So the manuscript pictured here is from Princeton University, from his own library, Mankhul al-Maghazi, and it is a compilation on the battles of the Prophet ﷺ and the Khulafa al-Rashidun. So during that time, they were reflecting on all the accounts of the Prophet ﷺ and his battles that he engaged in. They're deeply connected to their Islamic tradition. And there's also another story I'll just quickly share. So it's traced out here in this book by Leslie Blanche, who's one of the main biographers of Imam Shamil. And it said that during one of his expeditions, he befriended a cat. And the cat grew very, very connected to him, such that it would never separate from him. It would eat from his own plate. They would eat together. And so Imam Shamil had to leave on an expedition, and the cat became so homesick and depressed that it stopped eating. And they tried their best to make it eat. They even took it to Imam Shamil's bedroom to make it eat, but it could not eat. Eventually, it died out of depression. And then they gave it a state funeral worthy of their deputies and commanders. And they were afraid to tell Imam Shamil of the death of this cat. But it is said during this time, Imam Shamil would be playing with the cat and reflecting on the Prophet ﷺ and his behaviors towards cat, and how he would not cut his own garment to make the cat, to not wake up the cat. And so that story, that connection to the Prophet ﷺ also was present in his dealing with this cat. So that's just a small example of his connection to the Prophet ﷺ. And the other point, indisputable point, is that this was a major cause for the revival, not just revival, but for the building of Islam in this region. So Islam actually came to this region pretty late. In the 17th, 18th centuries, as we said, alcohol and drinking and so forth, other customs were quite prevalent. And it is through this resistance against the Russians that Imam Shamil executed that saved Islam and actually allowed it to flourish in this region. So after Imam Shamil, there will be some, scattered resistance amongst different people in this region. But his legacy, that immense respect of having someone of that stature of their own homeland, is what inspired them to continue. So in the Soviet Empire in the 20th century, there will be immense repression of Islam. They won't be able to take their Arabic texts or Qur'ans or manuscripts anywhere out, or they'll get imprisoned or shot. And during that time of period, for Islam to survive that immense repression can only come from a region which had this great attachment to Islam, revived to the likes of Imam Shamil. And and that brings me to the end of this presentation. So I guess I can take some questions if there's any. Yes. No, there's no connection between the Indian Mutiny of 1857 and the resistance here. A lot of this is happening concurrently, but there's no resistance. I mean, the only connection, direct connection, is to the Ottoman Empire. And over there's a Crimean War in the 1850s. And Imam Shamil is actually really happy that the Ottomans are now fighting the Russians. Maybe we can fight together. But the Ottomans are actually fighting with the British in French against the Russians. Uh, so even though the Ottomans actually win, they have to make some concessions where they leave the Caucasus again to the Russians to do whatever they want. So no one can come to their rescue. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, historically, Sufi movements were involved in so many resistance movements. I mean, if you look at South Asia, Sayyid Ahmed Shahid, Sayyid Ahmed Barelvi himself was a Sufi leader. He fought in the early 19th century, right before Imam Shamil's time. So Imam Shamil over here is also, as you mentioned, Naqshbandi, Khalidi. And then Algeria, you have Abdul Qadir, Al-Jazairi, and so forth. So, and there are many other examples as well. Some people actually comment and say that Sufism had no role to play in this movement. It was just, it was Islam, but it was not Sufism that had a role to play. But that's not true because Sufism gave him the authority in many ways. He was the sheikh of the tariqah. It also gave him the structure. So his followers were also called his murids. So this is actually called the muridist movement. And they would give their allegiance to him. And he would actually call himself Amir al-Mu'minin in this region. So that structure of a tariqah, where you have a sheikh and you have followers, that was really, really crucial to setting up his own structure, state structure at this time. But it is true that the Sufis at the time did not begin outright with armed calls for rebellion. They first focused, the first couple of decades, were apolitical in that sense. It was just about calling people to Islam, getting them to stop drinking alcohol and smoking tobacco and so forth. And then when that moment came, they were called upon to fight the Russians. Any questions from sisters? Yeah. No, it's from what I've seen, it's just generic 40 Sahaba who are buried there. That's often what you find in some of these regions. Yeah. But there might be some. I haven't looked that deeply. Yes. Alhamdulillah. Yeah. 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 So there are moments that parallel them. So for instance, there is this moment where Imam Shamil is writing about his frustrations with the Ottoman Sultan, saying that he's so angry at him. How can he continue to sleep in his palace while we are being oppressed in this way without sending any aid to us? So that kind of parallels, I think, what some people in Gaza might feel about the rest of the Muslim world. But there's also true that Imam Shamil was isolated. He was cut off geographically from the rest of the Muslim world, and the rest of the Muslim world was not in a position to fight him, to fight the Russians. They were defeated by them successively, and so um, I think what would be inspirational though is that he still kept alive that fight. In that fight, galvanized the people to hold true to their Islam, to hold true to their faith and to their community. And that's something you might see in Gaza as well today, where there might be no people are have the military odds stacked against them. There's no like major way out, but this entire movement is creating that attachment to religion and to their country, and that increasing them in their faith, in their connection to the place. So eventually, you can say that at the other end of this, they'll come out stronger, inshallah. Currently, so Imam Shamil is still considered a hero in Dagestan. In the Soviet times, there's actually this period when he was rehabilitated as like this furious anti-imperial, anti-capitalist hero by the Soviets, who are even secular themselves. But then that later was reversed. So amongst the Dagestanis, he's definitely celebrated. I've heard that there's some controversy about him from the Chechens. Even the president or the leader of Chechnya himself has made some comments about him, saying that why did he fight for so many years? So Habib, you might know, is from Dagestan, and he's actually from the same group of our group, the ethnic group that Imam Shamil is from. And one of his forefathers is supposed to be a commander in Imam Shamil's army or so. So Habib apparently defended Imam Shamil when the Chechen president made his comments. So he's still a major inspiration for them. And I mean, today, like the total population in Dagestan is like 3.2 million, and 95% of them are Muslim. So that's itself is like a sign of the success of his campaign. All right. No further questions. We can wrap it up. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum. If you do have any other further questions, Dr. Baig will be here for just a bit. Also, if you have any suggestions for our history series on personalities throughout Islamic history that you would like to learn about or would like to shed light about, we're all ears. You can reach us online, inshallah, or come up to any one of us up here, inshallah, to get some information. And also, if you'd like to take any pictures of the books for references, you're welcome to do that. We'll pray Isha, inshallah, at 9 o'clock. Assalamu alaikum.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله